Hello, this is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. This is the Brownstone Show, and I'm so pleased this week to introduce my guest as Gigi Foster, professor at the University of Sydney. She can correct me on that when she comes wrong if I'm wrong about this, but here's the thing. She had played a very important role in the history of world affairs in the early days of COVID. When the lockdowns happened, I was astonished to find that I couldn't seem to discover any serious thinkers anywhere, not within my realm or anyone else's realm, that seemed to be making any sense at all. And just digging around the internet, I found this firebrand political economist in Australia who was on some sort of televised forum. She seemed to be taking on 18 other people. I mean, that's probably not correct, but it seemed like that to me. And telling them the truth about the lockdowns and how there is no evidence that these things were going to accomplish anything, and that they were certainly going to cause a lot of damage and harm. And she was ferocious and wouldn't back down, despite everybody's shock and amazement at her opinions. The whole thing was hilarious. But, what I liked most about watching that event was to see the rarest thing at the time, which was intellectual courage. I mean, you just didn't see a lot of it. What you saw was a lot of intellectual careerism. People saying what they're supposed to say. If they had a slight disagreement, they'd mitigate it a little bit and this and that. Not Gigi. She was tough. She was erudite and articulate, and no matter what they threw at her, she just hit it right back, like a great ball player. I mean, it was something else, and it really inspired me because I realized, okay, I'm not crazy. A lot of people said this about my own writings, that like, you read my writings, you realize you weren't crazy. Well, that's how I felt when I saw Dr. Foster first speak. I thought, okay, I'm not insane. I'm not imagining this. I'm not crazy for applying the principles I've always believed in, like human freedom, civil liberties, and so on, to the particularities of a pandemic response. So that was great. It wasn't quite a year later, but it was about that there was a question about whether Brownstone Institute would come into being. And I wasn't sure, because it's quite a big decision to make. But then Gigi sent me a manuscript, which was written by Gigi Foster and two other authors, and we can talk about those two other authors in a moment. And I was overwhelmed with the book. I read it and ended up staying up all night long with this, because it was the very first book that made any sense out of anything that I had seen. And I knew it had to get out there. And I knew for sure that I would be the best one to do it, because I have a career-long experience in publishing. And it was just seemed like a sign from the gods that Brownstone had to exist. So I wrote her back. I said, all right, it's accepted for publication. She said, who's going to be the publisher? I said, a new nonprofit. What's the name of it? Well, I don't know, because I didn't know. And it would be our first book. And she's like, well, I don't know. This is kind of a stretch, to say the least. And I said, yeah, I know. But I got on the phone with her and I said, listen, I'm just asking you to trust me on this. I think we can make this happen. And sure enough, it was Brownstone Institute's first book, The Great COVID Panic. And I think to this day is still our best-selling work. So you can see how important she has been in the life of Brownstone Institute. And but history's moved on. She's been involved in many activities, some of which she'll talk about now. Welcome, Gigi, to the Brownstone Show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be on this show and help to bring it into life in its first year, as you just described. So in such lovely terms, we collaborated to do for Brownstone itself. So I'm talking to you from Byron Bay right now. And I appreciate your introduction. I will correct one thing, which is that my affiliation is with the University of New South Wales, not the University of Sydney, which is lucky because actually University of Sydney had a vax mandate back in the horror days, and UNSW never quite got there. So that was my great good fortune. I still have my job after all these years. Not didn't lose it for the mandates, didn't lose it for any kind of speech crackdown. Never even got a warning actually the whole time, which is quite stunning and makes some people think that I've got some sort of friend or that I'm, whatever controlled opposition means. But yeah, still have a job. So that's what enables me, sort of with you, Jeffrey. I think it's the same. You have your job to pay the bills, and then with most of your time, you do things that are important for no money. So that's kind of my life now.
Already, our listeners are aware you're not Australian because you speak with an American brogue. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Good mid-Atlantic state, and went to school all over the Northeast, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Maryland, had my children during graduate school, and that was the 5-year period in Washington, D.C., where we were living at the time, or very close to there, that we had the Washington sniper and the anthrax scare and the 2001 attacks. And my first husband and I looked at each other and said, how about we move countries? And he was Australian, from Perth, in fact, where I believe your partner's from. And so we moved, and I had to take a job over the phone rather than coming to visit the university first, because I had a baby who was exclusively breastfeeding at the time, and I didn't know what I would do with her if we came out, or if I came out by myself, as was the plan, to give a seminar, a job talk, as you normally do in academia. So I took a job at the University of South Australia in Adelaide. Never been there. Arrived and walked on the tarmac from the plane to the terminal and thought, what have I gotten myself into? Because we had just come from New York and Washington. So anyway, I had 6 years there. It's lovely, but kind of there are some ceilings, I guess you'd say. And particularly for the children, we wanted to find out some more exciting and adventurous things. So moved to Sydney in 2009, and I've been in Sydney at the University of New South Wales ever since. Yeah.
University of New South. So I noticed in your biography, you brushed over the institution that gave you your PhD.
University of Maryland. Yep, University of Maryland.
Oh, University of Maryland. But then weren't you also, am I wrong in thinking you were at Yale?
I was. So I went to Phillips Exeter Academy for my high school, which is the traditional feeder for Harvard. But I didn't like Harvard. And so when we did the college tours, I much preferred Yale because it had a mission of service at the time, anyway, mission of service to the humanity, kind of more broadly conceived, that I very much identify with, rather than one particular group or section or, sect. And so I really like that. To this day, Yale honors a day of service in May each year. So I like that spirit very much. And I like the feeling of the campus. So I went to Yale and did ethics, politics, and economics, and then did an economics PhD at Maryland. But
economics. Did I ever ask you what was the subject of your dissertation?
I don't know if you did, but it was social effects on college achievement. So the thing that's most fascinated me throughout my life, and still fascinates me, is human behavior in groups. How do people behave when they're influenced by groups in various ways? And I think the reason for this, and it's quite common for intellectuals, I think in general, to be fascinated by things that they don't have introspective intelligence on. I think I'm missing some wiring in this regard. And I think that's why I was able to be on the show you mentioned, ABC Q&A, here in Australia several times. I think I must have been on 4 or 5 times during the COVID era, and really not be fazed by these people who were attacking me, because I don't really care whether somebody agrees with me, is the thing. And most people really do, right? They really do. And
you think that's a different wiring in your brain that
I think
causes
I'm missing. That? I think it's a form of, I don't know, what do you call it, Asperger's or autism or something, but I just don't really care. I care much more whether what I'm doing is something I can defend intellectually, and whether when I look at it from different angles, it seems to hold up, whether it seems right. But social acceptance, social approval is evidently so important, and social influence in general is so important.
I'm so interested in the fact that you said that, because, I will admit something, that when I first watched you on that forum, and I'm talking about March 2020, April 2020.
April 2020, I think it was when I was first on that show.
It made, I described you as a hero, and you definitely are, but it also made me uncomfortable.
Huh.
You know what I mean? Like I felt like if I had been there, I would have not been as effective, but I would have gone much further in trying to meet the questioners sort of where they are,
Yeah.
probably.
Well,
With
it's a double-edged sword.
jibber jabber about, oh, excellent point, and not to,
Yeah.
however, I would say something like that probably, but no, not you. You just said, no, that's wrong.
Yeah.
You know, it was just,
well, I mean,
so yeah, it made me uncomfortable watching it, actually.
Yeah, I get that. And I think that that's sort of whatever we're talking about, autism or ignorance of what the social group wants you to do. At that time, I think not having it was, well, I mean, you could have done it the way you just described and tried to meet them where they were and whatnot. But I thought that this whole madness would pass, you see. And so I was sort of thinking, well, all I need to do is just set out the arguments. Just nobody set out the arguments for whatever reason, you know. And so I thought I was very naive, even up until probably August of that year, August of 2020. Yeah. I genuinely believed that if I just made the argument well enough and didn't cave into these misguided, nonsense arguments that were being presented as fact and as inviolable by everyone else, that I would, of course, crack through, right? And what I didn't recognize was the formation of a crowd. And that was what we talk about in the Great COVID Panic. That was, for me, the great learning of this time was, that's how a crowd forms. And this is what it can do. This is the destruction it's capable of.
The other thing, Gigi, is I don't think, I don't know if you share this sentiment, but I didn't realize, well, let me put it this way. I thought the world more or less worked. So, so that when governments would make ridiculous errors that were obviously revealing themselves to be ineffective and stupid and pointless and destructive, that there was some mechanism alive that would cause them to revert back. And then leaders would say, well, we did the best we could with what we had. We're sorry that happened. Please don't sue us. Let's go back to being normal people.
Yeah.
And I thought that's what was going to happen. And I hadn't realized just how broken things already were. You know, this is what I look back and think, well, why did I think the world was capable of righting itself so quickly in 2019? That's what I thought is going to end in 2 weeks.
I guess I had already been studying things like corruption in particular quite closely, and I had seen corruption in action here in Australia. So I was already prepared for this, I was prepared to trust my instincts and the evidence if I discovered that this was really not about health, which is, of course, what was very easily discoverable quite early. And I had seen, for example, one of my co-authors on the Great COVID Panic, Paul Freiters, have a massive tiff fight with the University of Queensland, who had hired him in I think maybe 2011 or so, and he'd worked there until 2016. And he had this massive fight about a paper that he put out showing that the bus driving personnel, force in Brisbane and sort of greater Brisbane was racist. And he did it with a simple sort of study of in the field where he had research assistants go on of different races and different kinds of clothes and, with an empty travel card. And they had to ask the bus driver if they could be taken to the next stop with no money. And the white guys got a ride more often and the black guys got a ride less often, right? And if you wanted to get a ride as often as the white guys, as a black guy, you got to wear a suit or an army costume, it was a standard sort of, in the field study of real world racism. And what happened was that the bus driver's company, the whatever bus authority, really didn't like this when they saw it on the television. So the University of Queensland initially put it out, press office put it out. They were very proud, blah, blah, blah. And then the bus company's CEO or someone apparently called the university and said, you got to get your academic back in line. And hence, after that followed this massive fight, and they tried to demote him. They tried to say that he had engaged in academic misconduct, and eventually went all the way to the Fair Work Commission, and he won on procedural grounds, on the grounds that they had not treated him with procedural fairness, and he quit the next day. And that is what motivated him to move to London to take a job.
I didn't know any of this. No, that's so fascinating.
Yep, that's
so you're aware that something was broken.
Yeah. I had
within
seen
elite opinions.
I'd seen corruption up close here in Australia, at least, and certainly, expected it to be the case in the United States. Had seen, had a little inkling of some of the things going wrong before I'd left the United States, and I'd already also done quite controversial research here on international education, for example, and that got quite suppressed. It was not embraced at all, even though I was pointing a way to basically have a more efficient and fairer higher education system. Nobody seemed to be interested. I remember going down to Canberra, knocking on doors, and I just didn't get anywhere at all. And so I had already had clues that some things were a little rotten. But at the same time, like you, I mean, I think you and I share a kind of, I don't know, naive gullibility or something. I don't know what to call it, but a belief that, people are good, of course, and people want the right thing, and they don't want to hurt people. They don't want to hurt their fellow man. And they're going to try to do the right thing. And when you see these massive webs of corruption and these people who are willingly, in a cowardly fashion, turning away from their duty and their responsibility to do the right thing, it can be very disheartening. I almost don't believe it. But it's just true.
And Australia had its own particular kind of problems. I mean, one was this kind of Prospero-like perception that they would hide from the virus thanks to being an island. And I remember the Prime Minister, at one point I was watching Australian news, and the Prime Minister said something like, maybe it wasn't Prime Minister, but it was somebody else, said something like, Australia is right now the envy of the world. Everybody in the world wishes they could be like us. And I thought, what are you talking about?
I know.
What could this possibly mean? I mean, let's say, for example, it works to completely hide from the virus. Like, how long are you going to do that? For 1,000 years? I mean, none of it made any sense. The same thing happened in New Zealand, of course.
Exactly.
I think on a worse scale.
Yep.
But Australia's pretty bad. And then it became, okay, Australia as a whole will hide from the world and not let the virus in. And then it broke it down into states. So suddenly you had severe travel restrictions between states in Australia.
Yep, that's right. All the different premiers, as we call them, had different rules. And I mean, there was some the whole thing was completely nutty, of course. The worst was probably Victoria. They had the longest lockdowns in the world there, even though they had minimal.
That's what that Stalinist guy who wouldn't let you drink a beer on the footpath or whatever.
Exactly. And you had to drink through your mask. I mean, just.
Yeah, I forget that guy's name. I don't know what happened.
Daniel Andrews. Thank you very much. Yeah. Daniel Andrews. Yeah, we had lots of facetious statues of him made up after that. And then in Western Australia, we had Mark McGowan, who was the kind of the butt of everybody's jokes when he brought on an Aboriginal translator for his comments about the vaccine. The Aboriginal translator basically just in pidgin English said exactly the same thing he said. But yeah, he also closed borders. And even though they had 3 cases of COVID, I mean, it was just the level of illness, of degree of health threat here was so minimal in most states and territories. And then, Queensland, we had the border closures, which then cost at least one baby its life, unborn, just the mother couldn't get to the, hospital she needed to get to or something, and she lost a baby. I mean, just absolutely insane sorts of decisions. And the hubris seems so clear now because the few mea culpa, kind of type conversations that politicians at the time and health department heads at the time have had with the media indicate, to me at least, that they genuinely thought that what they were doing was kind of the right direction. I mean, it's gross incompetence, but they just had no compassion for people who were in a different position. And I know you had that in the US too. You had these kind of apparatchiks, not really maybe the top guys or the guys in the back room who were kind of more the strategists, but a lot of the people at the front were just, they were petrified themselves. They were caught in a system where they couldn't do anything else. And they just didn't have the breadth of mind to recognize that people who were not like them were going to be in different situations, different circumstances, and this law would really hurt them. There was a total failure of compassion. And that, I think, what really came out in one of Brett Sutton's comments about a year or two ago. This was a health minister in Victoria, who at the time became a bit of a sex symbol, go on and give all the COVID porn at the beginning of every day, and all the girls would swoon. And he did a little bit of a mea culpa in the press. Maybe this was a year ago. And he sort of said, yeah, we thought, maybe some of the things we did were not so great, but, it was not, I sort of thought that maybe, this was the only thing we could do. And there was just no thinking about the different types of impacts on people who were not the laptop class, people who were not themselves in a cushy job that was protected by all of this, government, you can't fire anyone kind of stuff. And basically had to somehow work it through. And they had this belief that all you need to do was give them money. So that's what happened in Australia. We had the most immense fiscal outlay that you've ever seen, right? This job keeper program was the main vehicle for it. And so you'd have people sitting at home who were getting, very minimal wages out in the workforce. And they suddenly had this huge payment and, did all sorts of consumption that they would never have done and got used to that. And we went into massive debt. All the states have massive debt. I did a paper for the Institute for Public Affairs. They had a whole section on Daniel Andrews, destruction of Victoria. And I did one on the debt sort of side of things and finances, but other states did as well. And Australia used to be much better on that. Our debt to GDP ratio used to be quite good. Now it's not so good. Of course, now that means we're going to have worse lives in the future because we can't spend on stuff because we have to repay the debt.
And then did you have the inflation? I mean, what was the total purchasing power loss?
Yeah. I think we went up to maybe 8 or 9%, something like that at the peak of our inflation. And I remember going on to a video call seminar, because it had to be virtual in 2021 or 2022, early 2022, with one of the people at the head of the Reserve Bank at the time, I think Philip Lowe, and some of his apparatchiks. And he gave a little presentation about how this was going to be great. Rates were going to be low forever. And, all this money printing was fine. And I remember asking a question, which was, are you worried at all about stagflation? Because, of course, that was, in my sort of, education about financial economics, we always use the example of the 70s when you had very minimal economic activity and too much money. And I thought, well, you're creating those conditions directly through your actions now. So how are we not going to get stagflation? And they smiled and said, oh, you innocent little, naive. That was kind of the impression I got. And then, of course, by a year later, we were in inflation territory. And so, yeah, we definitely did have, I don't know what the figure is by how much we lost purchasing power, but we've had a lot of inflation. It's still a little above what the RBA really wants. But I will say that the economy didn't tank as much as I thought it would, although I'm not sure I believe the figures that are coming out of our equivalent of Bureau of Labor Statistics and whatnot. But it does seem a little not quite as bad as I was anticipating. And I'm not.
A paper just came out a couple of maybe last week, week before, from International Drug Policy Journal, something like that really documented something that shocked me. That apparently a lot of people were hip to a long time ago, but I had somehow bypassed me, which is that there's a lot of evidence that the stimulus payments were spent on illicit drugs and led to a gigantic spike in drug overdoses, which contributed substantially to a decline in lifespans in the U.S. And there's this like direct route. It's like here's your money. You're bored. You're depressed. You don't have any friends. Use drugs. Die. I mean, the paper is mind blowing because, especially when you consider that the whole purpose of the program was presumably to protect our health. And next thing you know, you've got this wave of drug overdose.
That's amazing. I haven't seen those data, that kind of thing for Australia, but I'm going to look it up right after this interview. That sounds really amazing.
Well, I wouldn't have expected this.
Yeah, this story that you just said was the same for all these policies, right? I mean, we were supposedly saving lives, but we were actually destroying lives and health specifically, right? Lockdowns are so bad for your health. And I know you've talked about this a million times, but this notion that somehow it's going to be good for you to sit in your house and watch the television and be stressed and eat bad food and not exercise enough and not see your friends and family and be, worried that if you just go outside, you're going to catch your death is good for you, is good for your health is just insane. And we just accepted it like, oh yeah, of course that's true. Anyway, there's a lot that this period spurred both of us to do. And so over the last, 5 years, that's what we've been doing, right? And there is a lot. The world is very different now. At the
It's a
time,
very different place.
yeah, it's a very different
Yeah.
place. And I think many of us have completely changed our social circles, our
Yeah.
professional, collaborations. We hadn't found each other in 2020, in March, April 2020, when, you were writing on this very, very early. I think it was February, at least in 2020, that you were writing really, really considered stuff, for the AEIR, right? The American Institute for Economic Research, AIER. And in March, April, when I was doing my stuff, there was really no one. I didn't have a friend, right? You didn't have a friend, probably. We didn't have these networks, these circles where we could sort of test our sanity. And so you did rely on, oh yeah, okay, I saw one interview or one article by some person and they seem to be saying the same thing. Okay, maybe I'm not crazy. And then you try to reach out to them and it's difficult because of the lockdowns and,
We didn't know. Also, it's not as if I had your email address.
No,
I didn't know
exactly.
to whom to
I
write.
don't know who these people are. Yeah, you see someone.
And I did write you. You'd never heard of me.
Nope.
So it was hard.
I know it was hard to form these networks that we needed to form in order to fight back, in order to basically create spaces where we could preserve sanity and preserve a sense of right and wrong and really end up kind of preserving the values of Western civilization. But that is basically what I think both of us have tried to do. Brownstone, of course, incredibly effectively. I mean, it's unbelievable what has happened there. And it's so heartening because it shows how much goodwill and effort is, people will put towards something that is really good, that is really necessary in a dark time. And so it's wonderful.
I don't know what your experience in Australia has been, but and the other thing I don't know is whether this just reflects my own interest and algorithmic feeds. But what I see is more interest in this topic now than, say, 2 or 3 years ago.
Yes, I would say that's true. Okay. I think it's more that the two things have changed, I think, since 2 or 3 years ago. Firstly, there are more people in what I'll say to be our community, so the people on the other side. And so it's becoming more acceptable in general because it's kind of less of a fearsome thing to imagine, oh, yes, I might take a different position on lockdowns or I might take a different position on vaccines. It doesn't make you feel like you're going to be out on your own anymore because there are enough chunky communities. Again, it goes back to that social acceptance stuff. People want social acceptance. If they think that going against the mainstream is going to put them by themselves in a closet somewhere or in a corner somewhere, they don't want to do it. So forming the community by itself is a kind of a lifeboat, and it enables people to take a stand against the mainstream. So that's the first thing that's happened is we've been successful creating these alternative communities, and people see that. And I think the other thing, honestly, is that the vaccine damage has manifested itself more and more. And so more and more people have seen in their own circles damage from the vaccines. Now, maybe some of it's from the drugs that you're just mentioning, right? But certainly there are people who are willing to talk about vaccines not necessarily being all good today, whereas 2 years ago they surely were not.
Let me ask you about that, Gigi, because I don't think I've ever entirely understood your own thinking on this matter. Because when the great COVID panic came out, I think you put that book to bed, I'm going to say, in the late spring of 21. And I don't recall that you had a lot to say about the shot in that book. I don't think so.
I can remember what we said. So we sent you the final manuscript on the 1st of August, as I recall, because my birthday was the 2nd of August, and I was very happy to have it gone from my inbox. And at that time, what we knew was that the shots were maybe a bit effective, but definitely had what looked like quite dangerous side effects. And so we say in the book basically that the shots were perhaps somewhat effective, but had dangerous and sometimes deadly side effects. And that's all we could really hand on heart say at the time. But of course, if fast forwarding a couple of years, you would say a lot more. But in some sense, I kind of feel happy that we got the book out then. First of all, because it was, we needed to get it out as early as we could. Yeah. But secondly, and in those couple of years, 22, 23, if you were a non-epidemiologist, immunologist, scientist, health scientist, and you started to stray into territory of the vaccines, you were absolutely pilloried, right? More so than with the lockdowns. Even though the lockdowns were billed as health policy, I could talk about them because I could make a clear argument about their economic effects, quote unquote. And never mind that economics aims towards the welfare of all people, which includes their health. You still can't talk about the vaccines, at least during 2022 and 23. You couldn't talk about them if you weren't a health scientist because you had no footing. You had no evidence. You weren't supposed to think. It was like, no, turn your brain off because this is not your lane, right? This is not your lane for thinking. And even when you were supposedly thinking, you were really, if you were in the health sciences, you were supposed to just parrot what the dictats were. So you were really supposed to turn off your brain either way, but you were at least allowed to speak if you were in the medical fields.
And there was also something terrifying about it because, I mean, it's bad enough they destroy your social communities, they close your churches, they ruin businesses, they inflate the money supply, so they ruin the value of the currency, disorient everybody, drive us to bankruptcy and demoralization with all the horrible COVID policies, and then to add to that, the great solution and the ballyhooed inoculation is ineffective. But then to add to that, the idea that would be damaging and potentially deadly, it's almost too much to be believed. I did not want to go there.
I know.
I spent months and months and months hoping that wasn't true.
Yeah, I hoped for many years. I hoped I was wrong, about all of these things, because it's just a horrific thing to contemplate. I remember sending an email to one of my cousins, who was a nurse and had sent a wide email to the whole extended family with the sentence, "The mRNA vaccines are completely safe." And this would have been, I don't know, maybe June or July 2021. And my heart sank because I knew she'd be listened to because she was the family nurse. She was the source of good medical wisdom everywhere. But I had seen the animal studies in which, most of these animals who got mRNA technology died. And I thought, and I looked at the age skew, of course, of COVID, as anyone sensible was doing. And it was clear that young people could not receive enough benefit to warrant taking that sort of risk from a COVID vaccine. Because they weren't at that much risk of COVID. Young, healthy people just weren't, right? And so, I sent her mail and I said, Sally, please look at the data, even what the CDC says, look at what they say. And, she said I was offensive to science and that's the whole, shebang, right? And we've all had these kinds of conversations with people very close to us. She was not my only cousin who's in the medical field who thought I had basically abandoned science. And so, I didn't want to believe it either. But as you know, my co-authors, Michael Baker, Paul Freiders, and I, the co-authors on the COVID Panic, we put out a piece on Brownstone, thank you for publishing it, about our kind of considered maximum guess about the deaths that the vaccine may have brought about. And it looks pretty grim. It looks very grim.
And it was just like a next level. And I didn't want to take on the topic because I felt like we had taken on enough.
Yeah.
But at some point, it just became overwhelming.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever level of malice you think that public health officials had going into lockdowns and everything that followed, like it got worse.
Yeah.
Particularly, I think the mandates in Australia were population wide.
A lot of it depended on what profession. So I never faced a mandate. Being in New South Wales, being at the University of New South Wales and being an economist, none of those things triggered a mandate. So, but in the health field, there were people who were mandated in certain states. Most of the states, I think, if not all, mandated nurses and aged care workers and that sort of thing. And firefighters, weird professions got mandated. Firefighters? Why firefighters? But yeah, and we had many events, helping those people. And as I said in one of the early blogs that we wrote for you guys, I think that vaccine damage is, one of the major forces that has brought people over essentially to the science.
No question. I mean, I don't even recall much real resistance until the shot came out, and that's what seemed to trigger it. And I remember early on somebody saying to me, "Oh, so you're an anti-vaxxer?" And I thought, what is that? Are there really such people who are against vaccines? And if they're big enough to constitute a group that that has a name, what possibly could be their rationale, right? It raised all sorts of questions in my mind.
I know, the church of the anti-vaccine. Well, again, it's this notion that, and it's funny how people project. I don't know if you found this during this time. So many of the epithets that get levied towards us are really epithets that should be levied in the opposite direction, right? And there's just projection everywhere. And even the term anti-vax, it assumes that the target is believing in something in an ideological fashion rather than taking a measured and scientific approach. And of course, that's exactly what the pro-vax, non-thinking pro-vax position used to be, which is, well, if it says vaccine on the bottle, it must be safe and effective, right? That was basically the position, because people had this great foundational faith in the health systems and the regulatory systems and the correction systems, what you spoke of before. Like, of course, society would not deliver us a vaccine that was not safe and effective for all of these checks and balances reasons. Right. And so because, in fact, in the mind of the believer, it's an ideological rather than a scientific process that gets you to the position of saying, yes, I think this vaccine is okay, they assume that their opponent must also be taking an ideological position. So it's a projection. So the notion that you're actually approaching this with a scientific basis is foreign. It's foreign.
Well, there's a strange sort of rhetoric associated with all this stuff that I've had a hard time wrapping my brain around. I mean, if you went to a restaurant and you saw the menu had a hamburger and a cheeseburger, and you ordered the hamburger, and then the waiter confronted you and said, why you hate cheese?
Yes.
I mean, it's not that I hate. I just want to have a hamburger. No, why? How come? If people like you proliferate, the whole cheese industry will be bankrupt. I mean, if somebody spoke that way, so you think, what is wrong with you?
I know. But also what was wrong with you in that situation is that the hamburger wasn't supposed to exist, you see, because if you were thinking, if you read hamburger on the menu, it showed that you actually still had some brain cells of your own, right? We were supposed to be led down the garden path of believing that the only way to fight COVID was the vaccine. So if you had discovered that going out and getting some sunshine and maybe doing some saltwater gargles and occasionally getting some ivermectin under the counter from your prevented pharmacist was a good idea to fight COVID, and those were alternatives to taking the vaccine, you had given evidence of your sins, and so you were, eligible to be smeared.
Yeah, but there's something special about the vaccine as a consumer product, that it's something that is widely believed, and how it always has been, as far as I can tell, believed that everyone needs to participate in it, or else something terrible will happen. I don't know if it's utilitarianism or herd immunity theory or what. But,
I think it is this notion of protection of self, and we all are in this together. That's what sells a lot of vaccines. They're capitalizing on altruism, as you know. Actually, it's one of the points I made in the TEDx talk that I gave that was banned, but that you put up on Rumble. Thank you. Was that there has been a hijacking of altruism throughout this period on different levels and different dimensions, and that's just one of them. Which is, if you care about everybody else, you should get this vaccine. And of course, the connection between getting the vaccine and really protecting everybody else is never really fully defended on rational grounds.
And this is particularly insidious in the Australian culture, because Australia is famous for its slogan, "We're all in this together," right?
Yep.
But the number one thing I noticed from my trips to Australia was it's the standout feature of the country and the culture for me was that people trusted the government.
Oh, yes.
And I had never encountered that before. And I get it, right? I mean, at the airport, I lost my wallet. A nice lady with the whatever customs found it and came to me very excitedly in a very friendly accent. You ask the police for directions on the street and they say, no worries. I mean, this kind of public culture I've never encountered before in my life, because in the U.S. it certainly doesn't exist. But it turns out, and even though there's something idyllic about this idea of a thoroughly integrated population that was just adored its public life, I guess you could say, that turned out to be that very impulse was turned against the population, so that suddenly public health became weaponized against the people.
Definitely. And that sort of attitude is interesting in Australia because a lot of us, when I was growing up, at least, we thought that the Australians were all like Paul Hogan and sort of Ned Kelly, right? They were sort of rebels and larrikins and all this and anti-authority, right? And then what really happens is when stuff gets bad, when reality strikes and you're really in a crisis, the Australians look to daddy. They look to daddy. They look to the government. And people say this is a cultural handover from the convict past, where we brought over convicts, but we brought over the bobbies as well. And so you were bringing over your overseers, and they were the ones who were protecting you from this harsh climate and the difficult, uncertain life that you had to lead. So, and that's what I've seen during this time. Now, it is true that eventually, if you're forced to undergo suffering at the hands of authority for a long enough time, sometimes the Australians will do what we call spit the dummy. So the dummy is a pacifier. So it's like a baby who's sucking and sucking and sucking and happily, doing what its
dummy. I love it.
So the parents, are trying to shut the baby up because maybe it's been crying. They put the dummy in, the baby is sucking. And eventually the baby's like, no, this is not good enough. You spit it out of the mouth and right. So that does occasionally happen, but it has to get bad enough. And it has to be after a period of abuse by the authorities. So we've seen that a little bit with some of the people in the resistance here, some of the Australians. That they sort of were accepting it for a long enough time. And then they just got to a point where they're like, yeah, no more. And then they started to finally fight back. So you have that, but you also have the expats who have come, and there is a disproportionate fraction of expats in the resistance and restoration community here in Australia.
Now, what about the indigenous population? This seemed like am I right that there was some resistance there particularly towards the vaccine?
Oh yeah, and there were horrific signs, sort of scenes that we saw of authority figures chasing down Aboriginal people who didn't want these vaccines, and then forcing them to take it in order to, I don't even know what it was that the requirement was to keep their welfare benefits or to be able to come to school or some stupid thing. So yeah, there was definitely resistance there. And the video I mentioned of Mark McGowan with the Aboriginal translator, saying things like, white fella vaccine, gotta take it, gotta take a shot, gotta take a shot, whatever it was she said. It was just insane. It was honestly, it looked like a satire, and it looked like it was essentially kind of a racist satire. And so that's what was made fun of around the world, because people were like, you've got to be kidding me. But that's what he did. And yeah, they were trying to reach the Aboriginal community specifically. And of course, in the logic of the mainstream at the time, the notion would have been, well, these are some of our worst off citizens, which they are, the outcomes are awful. So yeah, we have to help them the most, right? Get the vaccines to them, get all the stuff we've got to them because they don't have access to all these wonderful things we have.
I seem to recall some video with Aboriginal people dressed in war paint and everything, confronting a public health person trying to jab them with. I don't know if that was AI or what.
Yeah, that might be the same video I'm thinking of. It's not necessarily war paint, but yeah, the painted, the traditional painting and all. We definitely saw some of those things from the Northern Territory, which is where there's a large Aboriginal population here, and we've had some inroads in the Aboriginal community in the resistance as well. Warren Mundine, Anthony Dillon, they both spoke at our recent Australians for Science and Freedom conference, and so we've had some reasonable kind of dialogue with them, and I think some of them have really woken up. Some of their leadership.
And isn't it remarkable that this goes on at the same time in Australian culture? You have this sort of heightened consciousness of against colonialism, right?
Yes.
So that every event has to open up with a land acknowledgement. But when it comes to jabbing people with an experimental potion, forget that.
I know.
We're all about colonialism now.
Well, I mean, but that inability to see historical parallels has also really struck me during this time. I remember having dreams about Schindler's List, back in the 2021, 22 kind of dark periods. And the fact that people didn't see the parallel to the rise of the Third Reich in what we were seeing all around us, and teachers were teaching this stuff in classrooms, history classrooms, and they didn't see that this was happening again, and I just... I couldn't understand why people were unable to see those parallels. And I think it's just because of the compartmentalization that people are so capable of when it is in their interests to compartmentalize, to rationalize, to justify. And we certainly found that most of the people, the more educated you would be, including, of course, the top echelons of the academy, right, which I'm in, the more you would go along with the mainstream, and the more ridiculous justifications you would find spouting from their lips about why all of these nonsense policies were good. And people would be taken in by that stuff because, of course, they were experts. They were the expert class, so they must know what they're talking about. And the Australians, in addition to the other cultural elements we've talked about, have a bit of this cultural cringe. They don't quite back themselves. They don't think they're good enough quite. Classic thing, a great Australian product, but it's, poorly marketed, poorly packaged, isn't really given the kind of platform that it should be given to be able to make it in the world. A lot of our innovators go overseas because they don't get support here. So the Joe on the street, who doesn't really know what he's thinking, doing, or how to interpret his world, will look on a television screen at some doctor who says, yes, these are safe and effective. And he'll be like, okay, I guess they are. Very willing to just go along with that. More so than the average Joe Schmo American, I think.
Has that changed a lot? Do you have any evidence of, like in the U.S., we have these public opinion polls about, like, do you trust the government to do the right thing? Yeah. Which 50 years ago, 75 years ago was, no, 50 years ago was, well, 60 years ago, was like 80% said yes, and now it's like 17%.
Yeah.
Do you have similar kind of data from Australia on how the pandemic response affected the public?
Like trust in government. So trust in institutions has definitely fallen here. But I don't think it's quite as extreme as in the United States from the data that I've seen. And I think it does recover more easily. I think it'll bounce back more quickly because, again, as you said, life here, even now, life here is pretty good, right? The only real thing that's kind of still hanging around is this vaccine damage story. And if you've been affected by that, or your child has been affected by that, or something, or your best friend, that can really hang around and bother you. But I mean, I'm in this beautiful place now, Byron Bay. It's gorgeous. It's tropical. It's it's just so easy to live, and they pick up the garbage, and there's not much crime. And I mean, apart from the Bondi massacre, of course, but it's generally, it feels like a safe, happy place. And so it's very easy to be sort of, you can get lulled into a sense of, oh, well, yeah, things are actually fine. And the politicians feed you pretty lies all the time on the TV. And people don't really think that hard about stuff. It's not a very intellectual culture. So they're not constantly puzzling at home over the dinner table about stuff. The dinner table conversations are more likely to be about, how did Johnny do in school today? And what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? Can we have the barbecue on the weekend? Rather than, what are we going to do to fix our country? It's very rare for an Australian family probably to have that kind of conversation with its children as well. The youth have been disabled comprehensively in a lot of cases, as you know, for various reasons, in various ways. And so you don't really have that kind of virility in the culture and the kind of confidence in the culture that you need to create quick change. Now, that doesn't mean we're not trying. So as you know, a few years ago, I co-founded Australians for Science and Freedom. This is a cross-disciplinary, science-based collection of professionals who were alarmed at the COVID policies. And to me, the most important aim of ASF, we have many events on different aspects of science and freedom and trying to preserve those. And we have, monthly newsletters and members forums and a blog site and all this sort of thing. But the most important aim that we have, in my view, is to develop and road test blueprints for alternative systems. So alternative systems of health, education, media, law, democracy, things that we know are broken now, that we see around us broken, and we know that we can do better. We know the knowledge is out there, for example, to build a better health system that actually preserves and protects and targets people's health rather than their just enough sickness, to be profitable. And same with education. We know that we can create a good education system. We used to have a pretty good education system. We just need to take what we used to have, modernize it for the presence of computers and AI and stuff, smart, wisely, not just using them as brain replacement tools and maybe not using them at all, right? But figuring out how do we integrate modern technology with the best of Western education traditions and really start to inspire children again and give them the tools they need to take charge of their lives and steward their way of life. Which is just that capacity has basically been lost in people in that sort of, young 18 to 30 or so age range. And so many of the things we've been doing are aiming to get people thinking about what would you like to see in that area. So our conference this year, we had a brainstorming session on education at the end, our final session, and people broke into tables and they just sort of brainstormed, how would we like to run this type of education? You know, whether it's legal education or medical education or education for boys in primary schools or, you know, civics or whatever, and draw up some ideas. And so we're gradually collecting this sort of compendium of ideas that can be put forward in new blueprints when Australia is ready, or whenever there is a regional will to pilot something new. We will have some ideas that are drawing on the best of resistance thinking and Western thought. So that's, for me, that's the most exciting, most hopeful thing. One of the, definitely the most obvious example of a pilot of such a thing is the new university in Belgium that you will know about, of course, because Paul Fiders and his wife, Erica Turkstra, bought this castle, literally with their life savings, in February, I think, 2024, to start a new university there, with the campus being the castle. And so there are now 3-month programs that they've run a couple of times, and they would like to run a 1-year program that condense sort of the best of social science and health science thinking into this very intensive educational program that is in person together. Everybody's living and working and eating and cooking and playing together, living on the campus. And so it's much more back to that sort of old tradition of the initial universities where you live in a community together with your professors and you're constantly thinking and talking about big ideas and learning about yourself. And then there's also an aesthetics program in the afternoon, so music and writing and sports and dancing and things like this. And you learn practical skills like statistics and cooking and whatnot, but also, you know, how the world really works. And so we've tried to reduce, you know, what Western thought has given us into the most useful knowledge that can be used to improve communities. So we are going to graduate people who can go out and be change makers in their respective.
What's the name of the institution, just for our listeners?
Yeah, it's Academia Libera Mentis, the Academy of the Free Mind. And you can see it at liberamentis.org. I'm sure there'll be some links we'll put on with the show. So it's in Belgium, beautiful place. I've been there several times. People can go and visit the castle. And they've actually just come out with a new book called Minds That Dare, which was co-written by Paul Fiders and my daughter, who is now, Sienna Baker, she's now engaged to their son. So they'll be married in the castle in April. So yeah, it's very much of a joint family enterprise now.
Okay, that's wonderful. Now, I wanted to ask about the people who participate in your organization in Australia. Have you encountered difficulties in recruiting academics, and if so, who are your main participants? So they come from professional classes or students or what?
Mainly professional classes, but also, honestly, in terms of people who come to our events, it tends to be people from all over the professions, not necessarily students, just, you know, regular Joes. They could be actors or garbage collectors or accountants or whatever. And they found us and they come to our events, and different kinds of people come to different kinds of events. So we ran a collaborative event on restoring the presumption of innocence. I think it was August 2024 or something like that. And that drew a lot of people from professions where they had seen men be pilloried and destroyed by false sexual assault allegations, that sort of thing. Because our legal system is, probably like the United States, it's very much aligned against men. And, without convictions, men will have had their lives destroyed, and including in family law as well. So you got people in, professional classes, but, sort of middle management or administration or whatever, where they just got accused of things and then they lost everything, or people whose sons had that happen to them, who themselves could be farmers or, anybody. So it's really very broad. And we have that as one of our pillars. We are a community grassroots organization. We are not a top-down organization. So we take guidance from our community, and we need to be responsive and actually not just responsive, but our actions need to be led by what the community wants and needs. So that's why we have these kinds of brainstorming sessions. What do you want to see in the health system? What would help you, right? Or in the education?
So that's something I found with Brownstone, that what makes us distinct from other research institutes in the U.S. is that openness to we work out in the open, invite the public to our events.
Yeah.
We embrace people. We have separate clubs all over the country.
Yeah.
And you never know who's going to be sitting there, what disciplines, what social class.
Yep.
or anything. It's just a real mix.
Yeah.
But it's the key thing is to have the invitation, and
That's
without
right.
the invitation, all you're doing is just continuing to just be fed by your old social circles. But those social circles all broke down during COVID, so we're assembling new ones.
Very much. Oh, yeah. I mean, many of us had completely different circles, and I have to still go to work, of course, and walk the halls of my department where, I mean, amongst other people, we have the person who was probably the most ardently pro-lockdown amongst all academic economists in the country. And I mean, he will not talk to me at all anymore. I'm kind of like kryptonite to him. You know, I pass him in the hallway, and it's like I can see his blood pressure rising as I approach. I mean, it's just amazing. So yeah, very weird dynamics going on there. But I mean, I do my job, you know, and I think I do a good job. People like working with me, you know. Generally, I don't work with that particular person, but in general, even if they disagree with me about COVID, they're still respectful, and you know, we just get on with our teaching and we do our own research in our own ways. But I don't collaborate research-wise with anybody in my department. Right. Because it's just I'm not interested. Right. And I know that the kind of things I want to write now, they would just simply they wouldn't have the courage to write, and they wouldn't believe that, you know, what I'm saying, or they wouldn't want to do that kind of research. So that's been interesting. But my teaching, I've been able to teach some of the young people some stuff about COVID that they would not have gotten in anybody else's classroom. So there have been a few hundred students, at least, who've gone through in the few years since, you know, the COVID stuff, who have learned about, you know, that era through a very different lens than they will have gotten at most universities. So I'm proud of
it. Did you get pushback from the students, or are they just amazed?
I initially did. So in 2021, 22, there were a few comments on the Moodle board. There may have been a complaint or two that went a little higher up. But, I try to just thread the needle, you know, just walk that line and not make it, I mean, I'm not ideological. So it's more just getting them to think, right? And not tell them how it is, but just get them to think, you know, is this reasonable? And so that happened. But then the more recent years, so 2024, 25, the students, nobody's complained. And it's been much more, oh my gosh, can I please work for you in any capacity that you have? You don't need to pay me. I'll do anything, that kind of stuff, right? They come to my office and just, please, can I work with you? And wanting to talk after class, wanting to be involved, and so they've come to some of our events, the ASF stuff. We've even started thinking about doing a matchmaking service for these young people, because the young people we need to activate the young people so much. Yeah. Because they are the future and they are the strength. They have more energy and vitality than you or I do, right? They're the
people who are most bitter about what happened in those years, because
absolutely
anybody under 30 had like 2 or 3 years of their lives stolen.
Exactly. And they may have had more than that if they took lots of the vaccines and they end up having negative effects, right? So yeah, it's a major thing we are facing and trying to find ways of, activating is that the apathy that we currently see in the youth. So we're having various events that are specifically targeted to them. I think it's been this sort of notion of being community-led and community-fed and trying to build forward for the community and build strength and sort of self-insurance at the community level. That's the only way to get people to start to feel safe, that they don't need to actually rely on government and look to government to solve their problems, because they need to have that foundation. If you have nothing, of course, you're going to go to the government. And that's been, of course, one of the reasons this has all happened, is because the communities were already quite frayed and fragmented and not actually very strong. You know, pressed to test, they'd fall apart. But we've been actively rebuilding those so that people feel like they have somebody to call. So now if you were to ask many of our community, if you had to raise $5,000 quickly, could you? Beforehand, they probably would say no, but now they know people like me or other people in professional situations, and they would feel like, okay, yes, I can call them if I'm really stuck. I can get $5,000, and not just financial insurance, but health, based insurance or emotional insurance. All the insurance,
community, just having friendship.
Exactly, friendship provides that security that they would otherwise be looking to government or to virtual communities to provide. And virtual communities are, again, when push comes to shove, are the virtual communities going to lend you, a place to stay if your house gets burned down in a bushfire or blah, blah? Probably not. You actually need to know people in real life, right? So we've been trying to, again, supplant those virtual communities with real communities, have events all over the country. You've done the same with the supper clubs, which I hope that maybe we'll be able to start up in Australia this year.
Yeah, I think I I forwarded you an email from somebody. I think it was in Sydney. I'm not sure where.
Yes, Andrea. We're
Wanted
going
to
to be
start a separate club.
meeting soon.
So
Yeah,
that would be fun if we could have a Brownstone separate club and then kind of feed to each other's efforts.
definitely. Oh, that'd be great. That'd be awesome.
Yeah,
No, I'd love it.
it's
So
easy
yeah,
enough to.
there's so much else, that's going on here in Byron Bay. We are actually celebrating the 3rd anniversary of the Cape Byron Lighthouse Declaration, which has been written about on Brownstone's pages, which is essentially just promoting medical autonomy. And we've been visited by doctors from around the world, including Kimberly Biss, who's just been appointed to the ACIP, the advisory board for the CDC. So she's an OBGYN, and she doesn't really know exactly what's going to be. Yeah,
you have an Australian doctor who's been appointed to the CDC.
No, she's American. She came here to celebrate with us the Cape Byron thing, but she's American. She lives in Florida, and she'll be going to Atlanta a few times a year now, I guess. And she's hoping she's going to keep her job. But then also to people from all over the place. Roz Jones, the Lighthouse people, Roz, Neal, and Cook in particular, put together a video that I moderated maybe 6 months ago called the Fertility Roundtable, which talks about observations and evidence at the coalface of impacts on fertility-related things, prenatal, postnatal, IVF, delivery, blah, 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 from the shots. And so we got, experts from all these different fertility-related fields to talk about what they'd been seeing. And it just got so badly shadow banned. You have no idea. And I think it's because it is so horrific. The possibilities here are so horrific. It's not that we've got full, complete evidence of exactly how many people, but there are plausible biological mechanisms of harm. There are observations of significant irregularities, and there's temporal correlation. So it's like, if you're not obviously, if you care about people, you're going to investigate that. And of course, it hasn't been investigated properly, which is a humongous, travesty in my mind. So that's another example. We still have censorship. That video got severely banned. My TEDx talk got banned. That was from just over a year ago. And
we worried about copyright infringement. Nothing ever happened, though.
Nothing ever happened. Okay, I'm glad they never got, because they probably don't want it to become a big thing, right? Because then you get more publicity, right?
Can you back up slightly and say the name of the declaration? Because I'm not sure that, I think it was a big deal in Australia, but
it was, yeah. So the Cape Byron Lighthouse Declaration. This is, so we have a lighthouse here in Cape Byron and Byron Bay. And we, as our celebration for the signing of this declaration, which, by the way, was inspired by the Great Barrington Declaration. So they signed it, and they got all these, signatures from medical people and nurses and, health practitioners initially. And now they've expanded it so you can be a lighthouse keeper anywhere in the world, basically, no matter what your profession is. And you choose a lighthouse is the idea. And then you keep that lighthouse. And there's this notion of the beacon of light and truth, right? And so for our celebration every year, we trek up to the lighthouse at dawn, and we do a video call with all these doctors all around the world, all these lighthouse keepers, and just reaffirm our solidarity and our commitment to medical freedom and the sanctity of the relationship between the doctor and the patient, and not being censored and continuing to fight the good fight in all the different countries where we are doing that.
Still accepting signatories to that?
It's still online. So lighthousedeclaration.org, you can go on and have a look. Okay. And it's definitely, Roz is trying to build it as much as possible. But I mean, she got deregistered. She was a child psychologist who came to my attention because she made a video about the harms to children of the lockdowns, of the school closures. And then our medical board, APRA, proceeded to try to dismantle her, deregistered her, did a psychiatric evaluation, all that sort of stuff. And now she works at Bunnings and is an Airbnb cleaner. And on the side does the Lighthouse Declaration stuff. So that's classic, right? That is the sort of story. I mean, I feel very lucky to have kept my job. But there's plenty of people here who aren't doing what they were doing before. One of our best journalists, Beveridge, is driving.
And I think, and we are coming up to the end here, Gigi, but I will say something that I have heard. I don't think it was from you, but somebody told me that within Australian culture and academic culture in particular, there's a tendency to revere American experts over native ones, and so you think that might have played a role in the fact that you somehow managed to get away with this?
It's possible. I think it may also help that I'm a woman and that I have a lot of media contacts. So there may be a bit of trepidation that if I were to get fired or something, that maybe I would go and squeal to the media and then they've got accusations of sexism or something. I think, again, it goes back as well to this, I just refuse to be guided by what the group thinks. I just don't think that's a very valid way to be a scientist, to sort of decide what's right and wrong. And I was very lucky to have, parents who really showed me what right and wrong was, I feel. And it's never been unclear to me. Very rarely is it unclear to me what the right thing to do is. So it's easy for me, and I can do this, and I have the energy to do it. And it's a marathon. I'm a marathon runner. It's a marathon, not a sprint, as they all say. So, it sort of suits my personality. And I have so many friends and such supportive family, all around the world. People have told me the same things that you've heard, right? This kept me going. This kept me sane. This saved my life when you said this. And how is that not the most motivating thing in the world, right? So
yeah, no, I know you've proven extremely important to Brownstone and to me during all those difficult times, and it's just wonderful you're still maintaining the fight. And isn't it so wonderful too, Gigi, that we have in many ways an international movement, and Brownstone has branches now in Spain and Italy too.
Yes. Italy. Wonderful. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and part of the reason for that is that the COVID response was more or less kind of sort of the same in most all countries.
Yep.
We've done retreats in Spain, and it's remarkable that we can talk about the same policies in the same way. How is this possible?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's very similar across the world. And I mean, we probably have a Brownstone chapter here if we hadn't founded Australians for Science and Freedom. Of course, there are many other resistance groups. I'm sure you have that in the US, right? We have a super group, Aligned Council of Australia.
But most of them are new, right? I mean, we have associated institutions here.
Yep.
From Independent Medical Alliance and
yes, exactly, FLCCC or whatever.
Yeah, and many other organizations, but they're all more or less new. And the old organizations they still got their funding, they still got their, they're going to keep paying their employees forever, but they don't have the credibility.
Exactly.
Because they weren't there.
That's right.
When they were needed the most.
No, because we are building the future of civil society, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
Alternatives.
Well, Gigi, it's wonderful to talk to you. Anything else you want to say before I let you go?
No, I mean, otherwise, other than come to Australia and let us do some events here with you, and and for your listeners as well, please visit. It is a culture of sheep, and more so than I thought, but it is also very beautiful. And we can use. Well, if you come over and you have something to say, we'll arrange some events, and we've got billeting, and it won't be too expensive for you, and you'll be able to experience the culture yourself and try to make some change.
Thank you for your time, Gigi, and thank you for your work. All the best.
Likewise, thank you very much.